다음 순서로는 오늘 포럼 행사를 기념하는 특별 공연이 있겠습니다. 대진국제자원봉사단 소속 대순 한마당의 사물놀이 공연이 있겠습니다. 뜨거운 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
Up next, we will have a special musical performance to commemorate the Yeoju Eco Forum. This performance will feature what is known in Korean as samun-nori, a traditional percussion quartet.
지난주에서는 여주 엑소 포럼
Thank you.
한국 전통 음악의 흥겨운 분위기를 느낄 수 있었던 멋진 공연이었습니다.
That was an excellent performance, which truly gave us a sense of the signature atmosphere of traditional Korean music. Let's hear it again for the performers.
이 공연을 준비해 주신 공연단에게 다시 한번 뜨거운 박수를 보내주시기 바랍니다. 다음은 본 에코포럼의 공동의장이시고 미국 인문과학원의 정회원으로 계신 종캅 박사님의 기조 강연이 있겠습니다.
Next, we will hear a keynote address from the co-chair of the Yeoju Eco Forum and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Dr. John Cobb. Let's welcome him to the stage with a warm round of applause.
뜨거운 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
I did not know I had two opportunities this morning, so I tried to combine things into one. And I will be glad, however, to talk a little bit more about how I think that our historical situation shapes the possibilities and the needs of our time. And I would like to say that I think each of us who represent a great tradition have a great deal both to be very proud of and also a great deal to repent of. There is something about any kind of meaningful organization that leads us to think we've got it right and everybody else is falling short and failing. I think that over history, that has dominated in the relationships among the traditions. Probably less true in China and India, but nevertheless, even there, I think there have been tensions, for example, between Taoists and Confucians and in China, and even among the various sects of Hinduism. What I hope that we have learned that makes a real difference so that we can relate now to a urgent, desperate global situation is that difference is to be celebrated, not to be avoided or to be regarded as meaning that one is right and the other is wrong. Of course, there are differences that cannot be resolved that way. But I think that some people, I would say a characteristic of the recent history of the relationship among the religions has too often been one of trying to say we're really all the same. Many paths up the same mountain. If we go deep enough, we have all the same values. In some ways, that of course is true. But I think it would be better not to need to say we are all the same. In my case, my most extensive dialogues with different traditions have been with Buddhists. And I have been very impressed by the fact that Buddhists have many understandings that are deeper than any that we have in our Western traditions on various topics. And I think at the same time, they are learning some things from the dialogue with Christians. I think that Christianity has been very limited in its exploration of the world of meditation. Of course, we've had that exploration, but many, many Christians find that in Eastern traditions, there are riches that can be extremely helpful. We don't have to claim that they're just like what we already have. It's their difference that makes them so interesting. But difference does not mean that we should oppose. It's by encountering difference that we learn and grow. I think that Christianity, or perhaps I should say the Abrahamic traditions, in some respects there are important differences among us also, but when we look at ourselves over against those spiritual developments that took place in India and in China and other places, we see we have some commonalities. And I think some of those commonalities are things that are a rich contribution to the whole of human understanding. And then I think that along with what we have and what the Eastern traditions have, we are discovering that the indigenous people also had a profound wisdom that is different from our wisdom. We have dismissed it as simply naive or primitive, but many of us have come in the last decades to recognize that we must sit at the feet. We don't have to pretend we already know it. We don't. We may know something about it, but unfortunately, the number of people who today have the opportunity to grow up in the real sense of being one species among others, one part of a larger family that is ecologically united. Something, though that's not the whole of it, but those are characteristics of indigenous spirituality that we desperately need today. So my point is that in this forum, I think I'm getting much too much credit for it. I've contributed a little to the plan, but I can assure you very little in comparison with what other people have done. But if indeed we are not embarrassed about disagreements, we are not embarrassed about differences, but rather are always listening to the people who understand things we don't understand well. One possible future that this conference might contribute to is a future in which each of the traditions retains its own distinctiveness, celebrates that distinctiveness, builds community around that distinctiveness, but at the same time genuinely is informed and transformed by its relationship with the others. That may be the healthiest future for the religions as we seek to move toward an ecological civilization. But there are other possibilities. And I'm more interested now than I have been for a long time in the possibility that we would just decide, well, these separate traditions with their distinctive organization and their distinctive programs and so forth are no longer able to give the leadership to the world that is really needed. And that something new, like the organization that is sponsoring us now, that certainly draws on many of these traditions, but doesn't depend upon institutional continuity with any of them, that may serve the future better. But there is also the possibility that all of us will learn somehow to liberate the deep wisdom that has usually been at the basis of our traditions, or may have appeared later, it doesn't matter about that, from its connections. Yesterday in Hanshin University, that was pointed out to me a magnificent picture of the crucified Jesus, and I was told that was painted by a Buddhist. I mentioned before that the person who first put to work Jesus' teaching of loving your enemies was a Hindu. There are respects in which Jesus belongs to the world, not to Christians only. And I think that that is equally true, at least with Gautama. I think he now doesn't belong only to the Buddhists, he belongs to the world. And his deep insight into the nature of reality is something that you don't have to be a Buddhist in order to accept. Even in a Christian country, I've been impressed by the fact that it may be Alcoholics Anonymous and other programs for alcoholics that really take seriously basic Christian teaching. One senses that the higher power, without belief in which that whole system doesn't work. It's not just intellectual belief. It has to develop a kind of trust that you can't have unless you think there's something to trust in. And the sharing with one another of the experience, the kind of confession, and then the unconditional love that it encourages leaders to give to everyone who is attached. Simply by getting it out of the church and into the secular world, it may be that the gospel message becomes more powerful. For that reason, I hope we will all look at our institutions as secondary. I don't think we can avoid institutions. We're going to have even more religious institutions if new religions come into being. But they must be in the service of something that is not the institution. And some manage that better than others, but so much of the controversy and jealousy and even the inhibition, so often people think, oh, you can't say that in a Christian church because that sounds like Hinduism. All right, let it sound like Hinduism. If the Hindus have learned some things we haven't learned, that should be proclaimed just as enthusiastically in other institutional traditions and also quite outside of those traditions. I think I'm talking about something that is now happening. I don't think I'm making this up. And if the wisdom of the past is humanity's collective possession, we may act, different ones of us may emphasize different parts. We may find a richer fellowship with people in one community, traditional community than another. But let us please do so in a spirit of cooperation. There is a chance that as the understanding of our crisis grows more and more widespread and acute, and I just want to add one warning. Let's not just call it the climate crisis. The environmental crisis is also from the poisoning of the soil that we've been doing a long time. So whole areas have become unusable, and those that are usable are getting some poison into the food we eat. I don't mean to go through all of this, just an example. The acidification of the ocean has consequences quite independent of climate change. I don't mean to minimize climate change, and it may be the most obvious, but that we were using up the resources of the planet faster than they can be replaced is something we learned back in 1969. We were already on an unsustainable, even though we didn't know anything about climate problems then, we knew we were on an unsustainable path. And if we really listen to that, we can't just say, oh, unsustainable, well, all right. Unsustainable means it won't be able to continue. And if you just continue on an unsustainable path, we're doomed. It has been very painful to me since 1969 when my eyes were open that most of the basic features of our society that we already recognize were leading to collapse, to destruction, have gotten worse. We have not learned yet. I think the climate crisis is getting more people to recognize, but we have to consider the whole thing. The extinction of so many species that is going on so rapidly will be culminated by the extinction of humanity. Before the cockroaches, I think, will outlast us. But surely we don't want to continue on the path where we have to ask which will be the last species to become extinct. So much of our concern has been expressed in trying to frighten people. It hasn't even been easy. I think we can create a general climate of distress and hopelessness, but it doesn't work. So it's very important that we have a profoundly positive message. And that was why I became so attracted to the idea of ecological civilization as naming a world that was not just sustainable. I mean, it's better to be sustainable than not to be sustainable, but we have to ask what is being sustained. And what we want to be sustained and developed is a life that is really better than the life that the modern world offered us. And that's not impossible, far from it. And I think that there has been a rich development of the way of thinking what is possible that would deal responsibly and well with all of these problems in a coherent way. And I believe one of the features of that is the reversal of the movement to the globalization of production and consumption. The only people who gain when we transport most of our food, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 miles before we eat it, the only people who gain are those who make money out of that transportation business and the industrial system that it supports. We can think together about how we could have a happier life together. And happiness is mainly a function of relationships and community. After you get to a certain point, further increases in wealth don't make a difference. That has been proved again and again. I don't think the children of billionaires are any happier than the children of middle-class people. They may be happier than those who really don't know each day whether they'll find food for the day. I mean, there's a kind of poverty that is clearly against happiness, against well-being. And the elimination of that kind of poverty must be part of any notion of an ecological civilization. But the idea that we can measure what we want to measure by the quantity of production and consumption, and this idea rules the world at this time. It's extremely difficult to get nations to consider actually finding out how we can make people better off. There are measures that have been developed along these lines, but to get a nation to actually make use of such a measure, that we have not really done. Perhaps Bhutan is the exception, but I think we all recognize that it is a very isolated exception and not a very well developed one in any case. So I want to emphasize that we do have a great positive possibility. Every day that we ignore it, it becomes a little less possible. That's why the feeling of urgency is very, very relevant. But we can create local communities where we live And if you can create a local community that if things around it collapse, people could still eat and would have fresh water. The issue of fresh water is probably the one that is hitting us already hardest. There are already millions of people who are having great difficulty getting enough water. And that will be hundreds of millions, maybe billions, within a year or two. This is not a future matter. As a Christian theologian, I am, of course, interested in Jesus' proclamation of what he called the Basileia Theo. It's so often translated kingdom of God. But when he describes what life is like in the Basileia Theo, it's really not monarchical. So kingdom is not a necessary term. I like commonwealth. I think that comes closer to the kind of government, the kind of way in which people are associated. And I really believe an ecological civilization means the same thing to us that the Basileia Theo meant to Jesus. If we could persuade the whole Christian community around the world that the ecological community, ecological civilization is at hand in the way Jesus said, the Basileia Theo is at hand. Sadly, when I keep referring back to Jesus, we have to recognize he did not succeed. He failed. Israel continued on the path of military revolution. There were two main revolts after Jesus, and then the Romans said enough is enough, and off with the people, and they were dispersed. Okay. That's what I believe Jesus felt himself called to avoid, to prevent. But the wonderful thing was that in the 20th century, a couple of very important and influential people decided to do what Jesus suggested. Love your enemy. It's not an easy thing. I mean, this is hugely demanding, but we know it's possible because it's been done. And if we could love our enemies in the capitalist system, we could love the people who are running the international banks, who call the shots that are so often call the shots that are so destructive. There is a chance that they also might love us in return. And that more and more very rich people, because very rich people can have hearts of gold, they would understand that the world should not be organized around the rich getting richer. The world should be organized in a way that the economy is in the service of the people. I have often expressed my view that ecological civilization has its best chance in China. I think maybe it has its best chance in Korea. But the problem that we see in countries like the United States, and I'm afraid in most European countries, is that the government is in the service of industry and capitalism. It's in the service of the banks, not in the service of the people. Certainly in the United States. As a dramatic instance, I like to point out that 75 to 80% of the people really would like to have single-payer health care. The Republican Party is against it, the Democratic Party is against it. Those are the only two parties of any significance that we have. Is that democracy? People want something, their political leaders say no, and say no for no reason that is relevant to the well-being of the people. I think this is something we Americans, I mean, that's not the responsibility of most of you, but there may be similar things in other countries. If we could really persuade masses of people in our churches and synagogues and all the spiritual traditions that are represented, that they have a key to the salvation of the world. They may talk about that, but they really have a key. and that the key is that we love one another in community, and that means we really take responsibility for one another. And it's very important, I have not accented it, it's been accented, I'm glad, by others, that we understand that the communities of which we are a part are not simply human. A human community isolated from and separated from nature is not really an authentic human community. If we really care about all the creatures that make it up, we can make local communities that can survive all kinds of problems. And we can, if those communities will work as communities of communities. I really want to emphasize that, because so many of the best communities know they are the best communities and they look down on everything else. And if local communities compete, they will not survive. But if local communities cooperate, that one shift from a society based on competition to a society based on cooperation, I think all of us know that would be good. But we have to translate our rather abstract knowledge of these things into concrete reality, and we have to do it fast. It can be done. The spiritual communities have in their traditions great resources to make this real. If this conference could really be a turning point, that we decided, okay, no more pronouncements, no more saying this, that, and the other thing, no more tinkering around the edges, let's do it. I think we would be listening to Jesus' message. The Basileia Theou is at hand. You have a choice. You can become part of the Basileia Theou, work together with others to realize it, or you can just go on the normal, habitual way, competition and mutual destruction. And the collapse of this civilization will be at least as terrible as the collapse of the Roman Empire was for Western Europe. It took centuries to recover. The great danger, of course, is that we will not, those who suffer most will not suffer silently, or that my own country, shame upon it, will decide that as it becomes politically and economically weaker, it will activate the one thing in which it is best. Number one, nuclear war capacity. Very difficult to imagine what will survive from that. We need to love even those who make those weapons and who profit from them. If we can do that, they may also recognize that they live in a world that can be a world of mutual love, and the world of mutual love will be an ecological civilization. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
종탑 박사님은 본 에코포럼을 위해 적극적으로 활동해 오셨고, 현재 미국에서는 과정 신학과 종교 간 대화 그리고 생태 문명 건설을 선도하는 가장 유명한 학자이십니다. 먼 곳에서 한국까지 와주셔서 이렇게 오늘 뜻깊은 기조 강연을 해주셨습니다.
Dr. John Cobb has been extremely active in preparing this Eco Forum, and he is one of the most prominent scholars in the United States in the fields of process theology and interreligious dialogue on ecological civilization. He traveled all the way from America to deliver his keynote speech today. Please give Dr. John Cobb a big round of applause.
존 컵 박사님에게 큰 박수를 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 감사드립니다. 잠시 안내 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 모두 제 자리에 앉아주시기 바랍니다. 지금부터 사진 촬영을 하도록 하겠습니다. 사진 촬영을 위해 제 자리에 앉아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you. We would like your attention for a brief announcement. Please remain seated while we take a commemorative photo.